Good morning. I want to pick up a few comments that you've made, and I'm going to try really hard this time. Each time I do this, I pick up one or two comments and then I forget the rest. And this time I'm going to try and make an effort to get through at least three comments before my time runs out. So the first is from Paddy, my boy, which is a great piece. I'm afraid it's a characteristically lefty naivety, I might even say arrogance, to think you can educate away opinions that you don't like. The implicit assumption is that it is only ignorance that prevents them agreeing with you, and that is categorically not the case. I think the left on the whole fails to understand, perhaps does not want to understand, that people feel their traditional identity under threat, that this threat is far from being imaginary, and that to many people this is the most important issue in politics. To attempt to educate that away is not a matter of presenting facts. It could only mean telling them that they ought not to take their identity so seriously. Either that change can't be helped, or nationalism is a bad thing, or they're blaming the wrong people, or whatever. Anyway, I disagree with this. And I think education is still the way forward rather than legislation. Legislation is simply going to stop people doing their worst. Education is to try and encourage people to do their best. There are lessons like PHSE, which I think is a vague acronym and a fairly pointless lesson. It could be good, but it's taught appallingly. It's a vague subject, and there are courses, incidentally, available to teachers against hate for Key Stage 3 and 4 particularly, but they're not very good and they're clearly not very effective. The policies on prevent, equally, are unfortunately interpreted in schools as a policy towards blandness. Bias is not intrinsically bad. This is why I think something like GB News is a positive, not a negative. It simply needs to be identified, and we all have a bias. In fact, countering hate is part of the UN Code of Practice, and the UN states that hate speech violates fundamental rights of others. But what is a hate speech? And that's where education comes in. There's a distinction between insults and hate. There's a distinction between provocation and abuse, satire and evil. Indeed, satire, humour, and sharp observation are the tools of literary discourse and have been since the ancient Greeks. And they are the tools of inclusion, while marginalizing individuals and groups by using divisive language is the stuff of exclusion. Education, in this sense, is not about a coy form of propaganda, which is what I think Paddy Maboy is suggesting, or indoctrination, but instead about changing the mindset of students, or focusing that mindset on the other and on inclusion and on positivity. The celebration of success, for example, rather than focusing on failure. That's why, incidentally, I so object to reality TV, and partly because I've been involved in it. Things like these talent competitions, like X Factor, they give such a bad example because they focus on the failures, not on the successes. It's the look of dejection or determination, resignation, that determined focus when someone does not succeed, that is the mainstay and the main focus of the television camera shot, not on the person who is successful. That's an afterthought. Exclusion, not inclusion. In contrast, in the Olympics or in any horse race or any race, the camera is on the winner. And we, the audience, whether we are in the stadium, whether we are watching in reality or watching on television or listening on the radio, we gather round the winner to celebrate their victory. And that's something, again, that goes back to the ancient Greeks. Their success is celebrated as our success. It's a shared victory. Anyway, there's one. Paddy, my boy, thank you very much. Beachcomber refers to me as Timbo, which I must say I much prefer Timbo to Timmy. Timmy makes me feel like an abandoned dog. Timbo is showing his inherent English exceptionalism and inadvertently promoting anti-Scottish sentiments. A law protecting women will be along shortly from Holyrood. Keep up, Timmy. Well, there we've got the dog in the end. And John Slavin follows up. He hasn't read the Act. Not true. He hasn't read the Act. He doesn't know the parliamentary process. Not true. He doesn't understand the separation of laws, Scotland versus England versus UK, and yes, he feels able to comment on Scotland from that superior English exceptionalism viewpoint. Well, yeah, I was partly educated in Scotland, so I feel I have a right to make some comments about Scottish law, having lived under it for a while. And on the contrary to these comments, Humza's law tries to redress the balance of the 2021 Equality Act, and Humza is quite right. Humza, incidentally, is somebody that I've spoken to, and I like him. He's quite right. I may be the only person left who does. He's quite right that an offence motivated by prejudice is and should still be an offence. Oddly, there have been more calls to the police in the first 24 hours of the hate crime against Humza, citing Humza as faulty, rather than against J.K. Rowling, or Rowling. Well, you know, the hate crime law may be well motivated, but I think it's misguided because it adds to police pressure when the police are already overstretched to meet the demands of their job, and they're not able to do that job anyway. So I think you can do the job better by looking at education, and education is badly in need of reform, and Scotland could lead the way in that. Scotland led the way anyway in the past in educational reform and could do so again. As for the need to protect women, well, again, it's Scotland that led the way with the law in 2016 against sharing private images and the Gender Representation Act of 2018 to promote women to the top positions in our society by law rather than by sort of tokenism and by good intent. By law, it's enshrined in Scottish law. Stephen Holmes picks up my piece about Johnny Mercer. He says, Mr. Mercer must keep his word and say nothing. I hope so. The establishment don't want whistleblowers, aka Dr. David Kelly. Dr. David Kelly is such an interesting individual. He was one of the sources for Gilligan. I knew his mother, and was ousted as such. He said at the time that he was not necessarily the only source. This was about Gilligan's claim that Blair had sexed up the report into the weapons of mass destruction, and it led to the Hutton inquiry. Kelly correctly identified an anthrax-making facility in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. He went to Iraq, I think, about 39 times. But his work was not enough. The authorities and the Blair government felt, and the Blair government felt that it wasn't enough to make a bland document more decisive. And Alistair Campbell, of course, is specifically cited in this story. Hence the 45-minute edition, and that was the area of Gilligan's whistleblowing, and in turn there was a fear that Gilligan himself had exaggerated Kelly's statements. Kelly was such an impressive individual. He was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, was under consideration for a knighthood, both for his work in identifying, under enormous pressure, biological weapons of war. But there comes a point when silence is no longer an option. The law is supposed to protect whistleblowers, and it seems universally to fail. And I've spoken to whistleblowers recently, particularly in the NHS and in education, and all of them tell me how their lives have been ruined simply because they opted to speak out about something that they felt was wrong. We need open courts, open justice for those brave enough to call out such wrongdoing in big organisations, whether these are private or whether these are government departments. We need to protect the people who are brave enough and who are determined enough to speak out about wrongdoing, because in the end, these big organizations need to become better, and they can only become better by acknowledging that something has gone wrong and putting it right.